So here we go. Indian Railways, the transport lifeline of the nation, is the fourth largest railway network in the world. From suburbs to urban transit, the Indian rail network covers the length and breadth of the country, over 120,000 kilometers, 23 million travelers, 3 million tons of freight plying every day, 7,500 stations, employing over 1.6 million. That's the size of Indian Railways. Ever since inception, the railways has been in the public sector, but more recently, public-private partnerships have been used to give the private sector a larger role to play, especially in capacity enhancing and modernizing exercises. In line with the increasing need to ensure fair play when we have many private sector, government has also decided to set up a rail development authority, a regulatory authority in 2018 to ensure competition, efficiency and economy in Indian Railways while simultaneously ensuring protection of consumer interests. Most recently, for the first time, private operators are being invited to run services across India's rail network. There would definitely be regulatory issues in implementing this initiative, which incidentally is the inspiration behind today's webinar. I am further elated to share with you all another inspiration behind today's webinar. A book on railway regulation has been published by our webinar partner for the day, the Florence School of Regulation, located in Florence, Italy. Book has been co-edited by Professor Matthias and Professor Yuan from FSR, both of whom are gracing this webinar today. The book has a chapter on India that has been written by Professor Rachna Gangwar, who is also with us today. Please take us to the next slide, please. I also share immense privilege to have two stalwarts in Professor G. Raghuram and Mr. Sanjeev Garg, who would share their deep knowledge and experience on railway and regulation issues. Professor G. Raghuram is the Principal Academic Advisor to the National Railway University and past Director of AIIM Bangalore. Mr. Sanjeev Garg, MD of P-Power Rail Corporation and Vice Chancellor of Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport India and past additional member on Indian Railway Board. I reserve the privilege to introduce them in detail when they will speak. I'm your host and moderator for the day, Kamal Kishore Sharma. Next slide, please. A little bit about me. I currently head the Center for Surface and Air Transport at Adani Institute of Infrastructure, where I am currently a professor of practice. Formerly, I have been in the chair of a dean and a vice chancellor at another Indian university, a CEO at a multinational subsidiary in Kazakhstan, ArcelorMittal, a former Indian civil servant where I served the Indian Railways traffic service for about 5 years. I have institution and business building experience across sectors and socioeconomic contexts. May I now have the privilege, next slide please. May I now have the privilege to invite Professor Matthias Finger, who is Director Transport at the Florence School of Regulation. Professor Matthias is a PhD in Political Science 1988 and a PhD in Education 1986, both from University of Geneva, Switzerland. He is an emeritus professor at École Polytechnique Fédérale Lausanne, Switzerland. He is a part-time professor at the European University Institute and the director at the Florence School of Regulation. In his past affiliations, he has been with Syracuse University, Columbia University, Swiss Graduate School of Public Administration in Lausanne. His research interests range from transformation of network industries in the postal, telecommunications, railways, electricity, air transport, and water sector. He has been editor on a few journals and special edition of the utilities policies for Elsevier Publishing. Warm welcome to Professor Matthias. The stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay, thank you very much for the very nice introduction. It is my pleasure to be here with you today in this joint event that we organize with the Adani Institute. What I would like to do briefly in about 15 minutes is to briefly present what we do at Florence, how we look at railway, and then say a few words about the book. So next slide, please. So the Florence School of Regulation transport area has been now, we just celebrated 10 years of activity. And basically what we do is organize so-called Florence forums. They are not only railway, we also do air and urban transport. But here in this context, speaking about rail, those are forums we organize together with the European Commission. As you know, and I will talk a little bit later, Europe is a little bit of a railway experiment since the early 1990s. And so we are helping the European Commission to think about, to plan, to establish railway policies. There are a few publications we have already done, and you will find everything on the web. Now, in the European approach, and I listened carefully to your introduction, is an approach in the early 90s very much dominated by liberalization, opening up of the markets, creating a single European railway market, bringing in private operators, access to it, very much in the same way as you are now currently doing in India. But most recently, I would say over the past 2-3 years now, maybe 5, there is a new agenda coming on, maybe 2 new agendas. One is the decarbonization agenda, very, very strong. European Commission, very powerful actor in this. And very ambitious, and of course digitalization, which is overlaying absolutely everything, has nothing to do with railways. It covers all the, it affects all the infrastructures. So in that context, you know, we have delivered a manifesto for the European Commission. We have updated it in the context of COVID, of course, and the market opening now, the full market opening in Europe is now taking place as of the end of 2020. In theory, at least, the European rail market will be totally opened to competition, not only cargo freight, but also international passengers, and now also domestic passengers. And as you probably know, 21 this year is the year of railways in the EU. Next slide, please. So a little bit of history of rail, and that sounds maybe a little bit Eurocentric, but rail started in Europe, but then, you know, with colonialism, they expanded very rapidly, and in India you're early adopters of the railway, but it's somehow the British model that got exported around the world. That we could say that the peak, and this slide very much summarizes our first chapter of the book, to which I will come. The peak of rail is already, at least in Europe, in the beginning of the 20th century, when most of the privately operated, fragmented railway infrastructures are nationalized and integrated into one single national public monopoly. And this is pretty standard in all the railway countries. However, after the modal competition, first from road with cars, I would say after the Second World War, but the massiveness is really only in the 60s, and then air more recently, we see some sort of divergence. There are countries that go more into the freight direction, like the US, Australia, countries that go more in the passenger direction. So that's sort of first divergence we see. And we also see the emergence as of the 60s of this high-speed new vision, first by Japan and then France, and it got developed beyond that. Now, from there is policy reform around the 1990s. As I said, in the US a little bit earlier, there was this idea to reform the railway because railway lost its momentum because the governments mainly invested into the road and left the railway a little bit aside. Railway companies were indebted, infrastructures were not invested in, and mostly modal share diminished to less than 10% in cargo, maybe a little bit more. But so we have a historical approach in the US where we already have horizontal competition of vertically integrated firms across the country, but mostly on cargo. The reform in Europe takes the form of a vertical separation of infrastructure and transport, and that opens up the entrance of private operators, competition on the tracks, but not really that a successful model. And the model we see increasingly is the PSO model, public service obligations, regional monopolies that are tendered to private operators. So I think, at least in Europe, we are at the point where we are re-evaluating the reform policies. Have they delivered? Have they generated investments? A big problem. How to harmonize technically, and that's a big issue in Europe because each railway country has their own historical standards. How to introduce competition. There is some on cargo now. There is competitive tendering on the regions. But overall, the modal share has not really changed. And that's really the reason why a lot of reevaluation is going on. And so on top of all that, we have new challenges, as I said before. We need to decarbonize. Rail is already very much decarbonized, but it can be done further. And of course, digitalization brings many new challenges. Next slide, please. So the book's main message is really about, if I look at all these chapters, you know, rail has a future. It must have a future, especially in line of the decarbonization challenge. Rail is the least CO2 emitting mode of transport, clearly, except walking and maybe cycling. But then there is a question, which rail has a future? High speed, I put a lot of question marks. High speed, it's clear there are some high speed countries, Korea, Japan, France, but there are new emerging high speed countries. But I think it's a very costly exercise and maybe not that much needed. Mass transit certainly has a future. Mass transit, as you know very well in India, this is in most of the country where most of the passengers are transported, and mass transit is absolutely needed in order to move the people in the urban areas and the urban agglomerations. Long distance has a future, but in Europe, this is very much hampered by the national borders still. Freight certainly must have a future because this is where the biggest potential for decarbonization lies and the biggest answer to congestion. And then the biggest question mark is probably in regional transport. At least what we see in Europe, you know, this is really loss-making. A lot of subsidies by the national governments, and maybe this will be the area where we have to think most what future and how to ensure the future, and where. So where is the future of rail? So we do have historical railway countries, and India is clearly one of them. That's where I think the rail will bounce back first, but we also see emerging railway countries which really invest heavily, Korea, Turkey. So the future is also there. And then, as I already said in the beginning, you know, there is this experiment Europe. I call it an experiment. The SERA stands for Single European Railway Area. The wish to totally to create an integrated infrastructure and competition on the basis of that infrastructure. So overall, I think whatever the future, a more systemic policy and regulatory perspective is absolutely needed, because we can no longer just look at rail. We'll have to look at other transport modes and and the shift from other, especially very carbon intensive transport modes, trucks and cars, to rail. And we also have to, as a consequence, we have to look at multimodality and all these hubs where you go from the one transport mode to the other. Next slide and last slide. Please. So this is the opportunity to briefly present the book. It is a book that covers, I would say, the main railway countries in the world, the leaders, the large railway countries, and India is certainly among them, if not the largest one, but there are also small, interesting countries where things where interesting things develop, like Switzerland, for example. So the first part of the book is really about country examples, and we have a very nice example from India in the book, but also from other countries that are not traditional, that are not sort of covered usually, like the US, like Russia, like Korea, like Japan. And then we cover transversal issues, technical issues, digitalization, high speed, mass transit, modal shift, and many others. Overall, the book has 24 chapters, authored by, I would say, the main internationally recognized railway experts today. So with that book, we want to somehow set the stage for a debate, and we are really pleased to have this event together with you, because that will discuss and help further the development of railways in a country like India, but all over the world. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak briefly to you, and I return to you back.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Matthias. That was an excellent overview of the book. I caught upon the three key words that you said: liberalization, decarbonization, and digitalization. Almost the entire world is worried about these, and the need for re-evaluation and harmonization in the European context. Though Indian Railways did not have a history of such a breakup of, it's one large monolith network. But the question lies in the future. You rightly picked up the which and where part of, and I'm just really looking forward to this handbook. It would be an excellent addition to my library. And, I cannot stop myself in commenting on the background that you have. It almost looks like an Indian printed sheet.
Sorry, I did not manage to upload the background picture you sent me. So that's my home background. It's a carpet.
Yeah, and the print over there, it looks very, very Indian. Thank you very much, Professor Matthias, and we will have
I appreciate your nice words about my background, because I have already been criticized by other railway people about this background. Thank you.
It's all right. So we'll have questions by the end of this, as we have more speakers talking about different aspects of the main themes here. Next is my privilege to introduce to you the next speaker for the day. She is Professor Rachna Gangwar. She's also contributed one of the chapters in this handbook. An associate professor at the Adani Institute of Infrastructure Management. She has done her PhD from CEPT University at Ahmedabad and her master's from University of Karlsruhe, Germany. Her earlier affiliations include Institute of Management Technology, Ghaziabad in India, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and University of Karlsruhe, Germany. 12 years of experience in academics and industry. She has worked with PTV Group, a leading consulting firm of Germany in transportation and logistics, and her research interests lie in contemporary issues in transport and public-private partnerships in the Indian context. Over to you, Professor Rachna. Your time, as we all know, there are certain rules that I have to follow for this and help us finish this entire thing on time. So about 13 minutes for you to speak, and then at the end we will have question and answers. Over to you, Professor Rachna.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamal. I'll keep up to the time that you have given me. Thank you. Can we go to the slide, please? A lot has already been said by Dr. Kamal and Professor Matthias, that the Indian Railways is fourth largest network, and it is one of the oldest network in the world. So can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So the Indian Railways, which is the vertically integrated railways. No, the previous slide, please. So the Indian Railways, that is the national rail operator. It is a vertically integrated organization, and it owns all the rail infrastructure, except for few lines which are built by private companies. These are the lines that are connecting either to ports or mines. As far as the operations are concerned, that mostly all the freight and passenger services are basically operated by Indian Railways. There is a partial competition in some of these sectors, and there is one in the freight, in the container, that I would be talking about, and then this ongoing in the passenger train services, which would be discussing in the later presentation. So, next slide, please. So the railways right now currently has a market share of 30% in freight and 15% in passenger. This share has been declining over the years and over the decades for various reasons, and these reasons are similar to the reasons in many other countries. These are for example, the competition from road sector, and also the competition from the low-cost airlines. So this share, which was earlier in the range of about 70 to 80% few decades ago, has come down to 30%. And there are many other reasons also for this modal share declining. For example, the passenger services, they are cross-subsidized by freight. And the freight rates have been one of the highest in the world, and so that is also one of the one of the problems. And there are huge capital investment required in railways, and given the limited resources that the railways has, and also because it has other obligations as well. For example, it has a huge workforce, and it has many other obligations to meet. So the dependency on the private sector of railways has been increasing, and that is one of the reasons why there have been the these new lines on with the private sector on PPPs, and then also there are some many other schemes also where the private sector could invest in. For example, there is a scheme for the wagons where the private sector can invest in wagons. So over the past few decades, there have been many areas where the involvement of private sector has been brought in the railways. But as far as the services are concerned, can we go to the next slide, please? So as far as the services are concerned, till about 2006, the Indian Railways was the only service provider for all the freight and passenger services. And container train segment can be seen as one of the first major initiative in the freight where the competition was permitted. And the response to this was quite encouraging, and there were 15 new players that entered the market along with the incumbent player. This incumbent player, Concor, is the subsidiary of Indian Railways. So this was the competition, a direct competition in the market, wherein all the operators could compete for the cargo, and the operators had to pay a haulage to railways to use their infrastructure, rail infrastructure. And not only the infrastructure, in this particular case, also the locomotive and the crew was also provided by railways. And as per the policy, the private operators also had to mandatorily invest in terminal infrastructure. So that was the policy. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here are the more than 10 years of experience in this initiative. So there are many unique insights and lessons that can be learned from this, and they're also very useful in the current initiative in the passenger services that is being taken. And for example, I have listed here the issues that have emerged over the years in this segment. For example, one such issue is the haulage that the private operators pay to railways. So, for example, because we do not have any independent regulator in the sector, so for example, there have many issues have emerged. For example, the frequency of the upward revision for the haulage, whether the haulage should be freight all kind or should this be a cargo specific, because in the beginning of the policy this was the freight all kind haulage. So for example, it did not matter what cargo was inside the container, but over the years these rules were getting changed. Then the haulage had become cargo specific, and also for example, if the entire rake is or entire train is loaded by one particular cargo, or there is a consolidation, there are more than one cargo. So then the haulage over the period of time, this haulage was made specific to whether it is what cargo is there, whether it is a full rake load with one cargo, or this is a consolidation, and also which commodities could be carried in containers and which could not be carried in containers. So these kind of issues had emerged as far as the haulage was concerned, and because there was no independent regulator, so the Indian Railways was taking the decisions unilaterally on these issues. And similarly, there were many other issues in the areas. For example, the terminal infrastructure were inadequate. So what terminals to access and what would be the pricing? So, and there were a host of issues in each one of these. For example, the maintenance facilities also, where would the wagons go for the maintenance, and there were empty runs, so how to minimize that, what is the implication on the business for the private operators. For example, the service levels also by IR that had to be ensured. The freight trains in India run without a timetable, and passenger trains are given the priority. So for the private operators, it was essential that they get the assurance, guaranteed transit time from railways, but railways was not able to provide. And there were issues also with the level playing field with the incumbent, because most of the terminal infrastructure for containers were owned by the incumbent Concor, and they were built on the land which was provided by railways. But for the private operators, they had to purchase on the land for building their terminals on the market rate. So they faced a number of issues after they taking the licenses, and since there was no independent regulator, it was having immense implications on their business model. So can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so in terms of the institutional structure, there are some very fundamental issues which are there, especially when it comes to private sector participation or the issues of liberalization issues. For example, the Ministry of Railways, which is the ministerial or policy making function, and the Indian Railways, which is the national transport operator, there is no distinction. The boundaries between them is blur. So the roles between the two gets basically there is no clear distinction between these roles. So the Railway Board, which is the highest body of Indian Railways, is also the executive body for the Ministry of Railways. So in a way, the IR, the Indian Railways, becomes part of the policy making process. So it acts as a policy maker, it acts as a licensor, it also acts as an infrastructure provider and an operator, and a regulator when it comes to the liberalization. And this arrangement, this structure creates a lot of issues which are a lot of conflict of interest, and creates such many issues in terms of entry barriers to the new operators, and also the level playing field with the incumbent. And this also can be seen in the current initiative of the passenger train services. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah. So looking at the current initiatives and the projects, so it seems there is a lot of thrust and political will, which can also be seen by the increased budget allocations over the years. And some of the ongoing and projects are being taken up on priority and on mission mode. For example, dedicated freight corridor is a very, very important project. And in terms of electrification, in terms of station development and other expansion projects, and high-speed railways. Also, though Professor Matthias said this, I don't know, but we do have one corridor, which is the high-speed railway corridor between Ahmedabad and Mumbai. So we have set very ambitious targets. For example, for the market share in freight right now, which is 30%. So it by 2030, this has to be, the target is to increase this to 45%, and also for the electrification, which is about 60% currently, to take it to 100% by 2030. And there is a huge investment of $700 billion is emphasized till 2030. So this all looks very promising, and this is certainly going to yield positive results. But next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. But this is my last slide. Yeah, there are some still fundamental issues which are remaining here. Despite the recommendations of various committees, the institutional and the policy reforms have been very slow, though the projects have been taken and they're taken on mission mode. But on this particular front, the progress has been slow. And then the approach on these reforms has been a kind of a piecemeal approach, which is not sustainable in the long term. There are a number of issues which require the attention, the reforms, for example, in the case of the organizational restructuring in terms of competition and the independent regulation and all, this regulatory body is proposed since 2017, but still it has not been established. And the most important that is there is the role of the Indian Railways. Unless there is a separation in the role of railways as a licensor, as an operator, as a regulator, till this separation is not being done, I think the success of any any initiatives or any in towards the liberalization or any attempts would would be limited. So this is very, very important to undertake some policy reform to make Indian Railways truly a world-class railways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rachna. Oh, my voice is echoing. All right, let's live with that. I'll not speak for much time. Can we mute everybody else? I guess that could be the reason. All right. Okay. So Professor Rachna very well brought out citing the case of containerization, many lessons to be learned, issues of access, service levels, level playing field, and a point very well brought out about the anomaly of roles of licensor, operator, regulator being one, and the absence of the independent regulator. A lot of these, and over the period, the history of railways, if there is one person who is epitomous who is the epitome of what has happened in the railways over the years. He has written umpteen papers, books. He has researched almost everything around railways. It is my privilege. Next slide, please. It is my privilege to now invite Professor G. Raghuram, my guru. He has taught me when I was at AIIM Ahmedabad. He's a PhD from Northwestern University, US, a master's from AIIM Ahmedabad, and a graduate from IIT Chennai. He is currently the principal academic advisor to the National Railway University at Baroda. He held the Indian Railways Chair Professorship from January 2008 to August 2010 at IIM Ahmedabad. He specializes in infrastructure and transport systems, logistics, and supply chain management. He is a fellow of Operational Research Society of India and the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. He has served on numerous government policy making and advisory committees, and he is a very decorated person. MC Puri Memorial Award for contribution to operations research in India, 2016 Academician of the Year Award by Chartered Institute of Logistics, Lifetime Achievement Award for contribution to logistics and infrastructure, and many more. It's my privilege to invite Professor G. Raghuram. Over to you, sir.
Hi, thank you, Kamal. Thank you for the generous introduction. And I thank Professor Matthias and Rachna for building up on this topic. I decided that I will speak, I think getting to PPTs, sometimes I tend to overstructure. So I thought I'll take a different tack. Okay, so my focus is on the, what's happening in the word says here, liberalization of passenger train services. Actually, I think the attempt here is to privatize or bring in private play into passenger train services. So we'll talk a bit about the framework, what are the kinds of ways in which they're doing it. And then we'll see, where are there lacunae, especially in terms of market failures and, the kind of issues that Rachna raised in the container train operations. I would only say that, unfortunately, the railways have not really built on that gap that has been, identified years ago to try to plug that before they went in for passenger train operations, where actually it's even more important. But that's really what I wish to talk about. So, in general, in the transport sector, if we are bringing in private play, generally the service side gets privatized first before it moves to the infrastructure or the hardware side. One can see aviation, so it's easier to privatize airlines, and then as airlines grow and they demand better infrastructure in terms of airports, then possibly, airports also some private play is brought in. But usually it's the service side that moves into private play first. Shipping, it's the same thing. Shipping lines are private, and you can say the land side evacuation, to the extent it is by road, it is private significantly. And then, now we are saying, hey, look, I got to provide better service, and therefore ports, which is the hardware, and maybe for a longer period under government, has also started moving into private play. In railways, unfortunately, the Indian railways have not sort of really looked at it that way until you can say the experiment with the container train operations, which happened, more than a decade ago. If at all railways initially experimented with private play, it was really in the hardware side. And that's because they felt, it would be nice to have just more railway network, and they tried to bring in private play, which was essentially bringing in private investment with some form of implicit guarantee, or depending on the traffic, or maybe just paying in over a period of time what the investment would be made by the private party. Now, the only issue there is that when you did the hardware, in a sense, you're creating a monopsony situation, because the hardware player, the rail network or whatever, is beholden to the larger railway system and the larger Indian Railways organization, and it becomes a monopsony situation. And as one would expect, it has really had limited play. In fact, the largest play is the dedicated freight corridors, which again is really not private, but it is just an independent entity whose focus has been on creating this infrastructure of dedicated freight corridors, where higher axle load, longer trains, faster, so per train carrying capacity going up significantly, that's sort of coming in. In fact, many times it was said maybe even the dedicated freight corridor should have been made an independent, maybe private entity, but also independent in reaching out to the market. Whereas right now it is Indian Railways only who will bring the market to the dedicated freight corridor, paying a kind of track access charge and so on. So anyway, that's the current lay of private play. I must say, okay, there is private play now in rolling stock. Traditionally, freight rolling stock has been private play, but it has been typically an outsourced agency. Railways decided how much freight wagons they want, and there were these private players. They would issue an order, and then the private players would manufacture against the order. So it wasn't really a business in the sense where the private player could then sell anywhere else and develop a larger market or come up with new designs and so on. But over time, the railways have liberalized that part. Today, designs can come from the private players. More types of wagons have come in. Locomotives of manufacturing has gone into private play. So there is some movement in that. But again, remember, all of these are a monopsony situation. So the first attempt has been in the privatization of passenger trains since last year. At least in terms of public sharing of information, we have seen that there is an effort in moving into privatization of passenger train operations. So what the railways have done is they've actually come up with 12 clusters of train services, adding up to about actually 304 services. 304 is to and fro if you add. So actually 152, you can say, independent services. They're kind of centered around one nodal location like Mumbai, Delhi, Chandigarh, Howrah, So it is expected that a lot of these services will kind of terminate at these nodal locations, which is where the primary maintenance center is expected to be developed by the private party. The number of services actually vary from cluster to cluster, but that is because you may have a larger number of short haul or a fewer number of long haul. In general, each cluster may require anywhere from 12 to 15 train sets. And that's the kind of normalizing factor. And so that's the expected investment from the private party. Train schedules have been pre-announced. So what was on offer to the private party is to, that they will run or they will put these train sets to run the trains as per those schedules. Now the bids are open. Of course, railways went through a lot of public information, trying to attract bidders. They had open meetings. And of course, the first round, they had what is called request for qualification, where 10 plus bidders put in their interest, and they had to be qualified based on certain parameters. So out of the number of bidders, I think about 2 or 3 were found not qualified. And of course, each of them had to decide for how many packages. So it's not that every bidder would bid for all the 12 packages. In fact, there are very few who will do or who have qualified for all 12 or even expressed interest for all 12. Some expressed for 4. There are even some who have expressed for just 1. Obviously they want to just get a feel of entering into this domain and so on. In fact, at one time, the railways felt confident that what was the bid submission date for those who were qualified as being 31st March, they advanced it to the 12th of January. But just a week before the 12th of January, I guess maybe the bidders themselves didn't feel ready enough. There were still questions in the pre-bid meetings, so they have postponed it to the 31st of March again for the bids. But I do know some of the private players, either because they've not got answers to all their concerns, or they feel the answers are insufficient. Some of them have decided they will not bid. So it's an interesting wait to see actually how many bids will come out. Now, there are some concerns here, and I think a lot of it points to the fact that a regulator has not been put in place already. For example, the lifetime of this concession is 35 years, driven by the logic that the rolling stock life may be that much. But the particular service may not have the same lifespan in terms of the demand, in terms of what else is happening in the competitive scenario. So, this is one of the fundamental issues that we have, where many times the authority who puts out packages for bidding, they look at it from a supply side logic rather than a demand side logic. And here the supply side logic obviously has been, what's the life of the rolling stock? But I would think from an operating point of view, even a 10-year time frame would have been good enough, because a lot of things would change in 10 years, and the bid conditions are not clear. How much flexibility will be offered to the private parties to make changes during the lifespan? In fact, it seems more constrained that they have to stick to those services. At best, at an annual level, they will be allowed some flexibility in timings, maybe some flexibility in the stoppages. So maybe year after year, you might make some change, but it's not as though you can decide that I don't want to run this service, or can I use my rolling stock to run a different service? So the framework currently doesn't permit these. Now, the other concerns here are Indian Railways are already operating a lot of trains, so it will compete with them. Now, thankfully, of course, there is no price controls here. Now, but then the question is, would these services actually sell for a higher tariff? Because the private parties are expected to bring state-of-the-art rolling stock, in fact, in a way overstated, because they are supposed to be able to run at 160 kilometers per hour, but a large part of the railway track network, the railways probably will get them ready for 130, maybe by 2030, and maybe in bits and pieces it will start moving to 160. So is it an overinvestment is a question that the private parties are having. Of course, then the other question is, can they lease in so that they don't really have to put in the fixed money? Now, some of these questions the answers are not fully clear, and I think that's one of the concerns. So clearly, Indian Railways has multiple roles here with tremendous conflicts of interest. Number one, it's an incumbent player and therefore a competitor. Number two, they are a critical service provider. The engine, the loco pilot and the guard, as well as the track access and the platform access, is being provided by the railways. So they are an input provider. So that's a second role they have. Of course, the third role they have is they are the policy maker. And a fourth role they have is they are the regulator implicitly. For example, if punctuality is not maintained, they are the ones who are going to resolve who's responsible for a train getting delayed, to what extent it is railways' responsibility, to what extent it's the private operators. You can clearly see there is a conflict of interest. If there is an accident, a safety issue, again, how does it get resolved? How do responsibilities get assigned? I mean, it was so clear that an independent regulator was essential to be able to resolve these issues. But the Indian Railways at the highest levels are still not willing to subject themselves or make themselves accountable to an independent regulator. So I think in terms of time, I probably, KK, I must have overshot my time. I would like to stop here with the point that, I hope I've given you some broad parameters of what this is. I must say that it is brave of Indian Railways to have gotten into this. I mean, passenger train operations are complex, but there are a lot of questions whether it could have been done differently in the way the clusters were evolved and so on. But I think the biggest concern in my mind is the issue of regulation, which I think fits in very well with the theme of our this afternoon, or to my friends in Italy this morning's interactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Raghuram. Quite interesting, in the way you brought out that private play is in many spheres, but how private are the private plays? There are issues there, the supply and demand side logic, the uncertainty in future, the conflict of interests, accountability, and the issue of 35 years of concession period, and summed up very well on, the main issue being the regulator not being in place. Thank you very much. So I have the pleasure to invite Mr. Sanjeev Garg, who is currently Managing Director at Pipavav Rail Corporation Limited and a Vice Chairman of Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport India. He's a Chevening Gurukul scholar at London School of Economics and Political Science. He did Masters from Delhi School of Economics and MBA from MDI Gurgaon. He's a very experienced logistics and rail transportation professional. And he has, within Indian Railways as a traffic officer, he has rose from a probationer to the additional member of the Railways Railway Board. Currently as a managing director at P-Power Rail Corporation, which is a PPP joint venture of APM Terminals and Ministry of Railways. So he will give us the practitioner's perspective from a living example. He is very skilled in operations management, negotiations, freights and ports. Welcome, Mr. Sanjeev Garg. The stage is yours now. 13 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Sharma. We can move on to the next slide, please. No, this is not the next one. It's first slide is on background. You skipped a slide, perhaps. Yeah, no. Anyway, I think doesn't matter. I'll just quickly say that. Well, in India, the concept of Rail Development Authority was proposed as a regulatory mechanism in the Railway Minister's budget speech in 2015-16. So basically, that was the first time it came as a formal, it was formally referred to, and in the cabinet of the Union Cabinet on April 2017. It decided to constitute a Rail Development Authority, and accordingly a Gazette notification was issued. Prior to that, about 2 years before that, there was a proposal to have a Rail Tariff Authority, because as you are aware, on the Indian Railways, the tariff is basically being approved by it's part of the railway budget and now the union budget. And therefore, there were demands that the tariff should be independently decided upon, because as you may be aware, the freight tariffs in Indian Railways are one of the highest in the world, while the passenger fares are one of the lowest in the world. And the railways have been traditionally cross-subsidizing passenger fares from the money that is being earned from freight. So therefore, effectively what we have been doing is on the Indian Railways, we've been killing railway freight by having abnormally high tariffs, and we are attracting passenger traffic, at least certain segments of passenger traffic, which should be using other modes of transportation. So there is a problem there. And that is why there was a demand that initially there should be a Rail Tariff Authority. Some notification was issued, but for various reasons it was given up. Then the concept of Rail Development Authority came in. It was proposed to have a chairman and 3 members, 1 member looking after tariff, 1 after public-private partnerships, and a 3rd member having looking after efficiency standards and benchmarking. So the main objectives of the RDA were pricing of services which are commensurate with costs, protection of consumer interests, and of course promoting competition, efficiency and economy, and encouraging market development and participation of stakeholders, creating a positive environment for investment into the railway sector, benchmarking, and this was important, of service standards against international standards, and enforce the same with respect to quality, continuity and reliability. And of course, providing a framework for non-discriminatory open access to the dedicated freight corridor infrastructure, which has now become operational in the last few months. And of course, suggesting measures to absorb new technologies for achieving desired efficiency and performance standards, as also for human resource development to achieve any of the stated objectives. We can move on to the next slide. So one of the important functions of RDA was expected to be tariff determination. Basically, framing guiding principles, rules, models for tariff determination for both freight and passenger traffic, making recommendations on tariff setting, including suggesting proposed tariff and revision of tariff, framing principles for determining and classification or reclassification of commodities, because Indian Railways has been following a system of different slabs for different segments of freight traffic, based primarily on the economic principle of what the traffic can bear. As a result, we have low rated traffic having lower tariffs per kilometer, whereas high rated traffic, for instance, petroleum oil and lubricants, they are having the highest rate of tariff slabs. Then, of course, framing principles for subsidy and social service obligations. Incidentally, it is estimated that in India, the passenger segment is being subsidized to the extent of almost 50,000 crore of rupees. I'm sorry, the Italian members may not be able to figure out what 50,000 crore rupees is, but in terms of million, 1 crore is equal to 10 million. So if we multiply 50,000 by 10, so we'll get that many million rupees. So it's a huge amount, and therefore it is felt that there is need for framing certain principles of subsidy and social obligation, because we keep talking about bringing down in terms of the total quantum of this obligation, but we've not really succeeded. And of course, to lay down guidelines and rules to determine track access charges for the dedicated freight corridor and other such corridors which may come up in the future. Next slide, please. Then, of course, proposing modifications and sending suggestions, advisory notes to the Ministry of Railways for realigning the risks distributed between the parties, interpreting all future concession agreements subject to such clauses being available, making suggestions regarding policies for infrastructure creation through private investments, and of course having a dispute resolution mechanism regarding future concession agreements subject to specific clauses in the concession agreements. Next slide. Then, as regards efficiency and performance standards, it was expected that we'll have defined standards of performance and efficiency for customer satisfaction in passenger and freight segments. Enforceability standards were needed to be adopted as rules under the Railways Act, and to check deviations from performance standards and suggest remedial measures, and finally for suggesting measures for absorbing new technologies for achieving desired efficiency and performance standards. Yeah, next slide. Yeah. In regard to dissemination of information, RDA was expected to act as a data repository by collecting the data from the Indian Railways and other operators and disseminate the same. Dissemination of information based on global best practices and benchmarking and standards, and recommending the process of dissemination, collect information from concessionaires and operators and sharing the same with the public. Next slide. We also, it was felt that what RDA shall not undertake it shall not be a policy making body. And interestingly, it said tariff determination and classification was not supposed to be in its domain, although it could frame some guiding principles or rules and models. Then, of course, it was not expected to undertake operation and maintenance of the rail system or financial and expenditure management, for setting technical standards, because for that we already had a body called the RDSO and the Commissioner of Railway Safety. So it was felt there's no point in duplicating that. Compliance of safety standards and practices, which again is done by the Commissioner of Railway Safety, and those functions which are already explicitly covered under the statutes and subjects covered by the rates and claims tribunals of the Indian Railways, which are also legal and statutory bodies set up under Acts of Parliament. So anything that was already being done by some legally statutory body was not expected to be taken up by the Rail Development Authority. Next slide, please. So therefore, the limitations were, it became, the way it was sort of framed and notified, it became mainly a recommendatory body. It could not even seek compliance of its decisions. And most importantly, tariff determination was not in its domain. And the list of exclusion also included those issues which are explicitly covered under the statutes. And it was not a sufficient measure in the regime of private passenger train operators and multi-freight train operators. And it was not expected to be, sufficiently strong enough to ensure safeguards for the customers. So effectively, what was proposed at that time was a fairly weak kind of regulatory body. But then probably it was felt that something is better than nothing. So a notification indeed had been issued after cabinet approval. Yeah, next slide, please. So basically, what happened finally was that unfortunate that even this weak RDA setup finally got shelved, because as I can see that people in power, they generally avoid a parallel body coming up which can question their actions. So I think at least in India, I'm not sure about Europe, where a lot of regulatory mechanisms are there. But India, one finds that most administrative organizations somehow abhor the concept of another regulator coming and overseeing and, peeking from their shoulders and then pointing out various mistakes. So that is what finally happened with the proposed Rail Development Authority. It was stillborn, and finally it never came up. So possibly what in future we need to have is a body like the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, either through a separate act or amendment of the Railways Act. And we need to include tariff determination as part of the proposed Rail Regulatory Authority. And provisions in other acts if in contravention that can be amended. There is need to basically provide teeth to the regulatory body and not make it a purely recommendatory body, because that makes it quite meaningless. And finally, the decision of the regulatory body within the mandate should be binding on rail infrastructure owners and service providers. Then only we can say that the regulatory body would be effective in achieving its objectives. Till then, if we continue to just have of course, we have nothing right now, but if we just bring in a merely recommendatory kind of body, it's not going to really serve the purpose that we are looking for. So hopefully in future, probably the Ministry of Railways will find it necessary to set up a rail development authority for the simple reason now that passenger train operations are being privatized in a large way, where they are advertising for hundreds of trains to be run under the private sector, through public-private partnership. So a rail regulator will become a necessity because many disputes will indeed arise, and it will not be possible for the Ministry of Railways to act as a regulator when it will be actually a participant in the whole framework. So I think in the next 1 or 2 years, we will have to create a body which will have some regulatory powers, so that the concept of these private trains, when they become a reality, they can run with the without any fear that there will be a body to look after their interests in a neutral manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanjeev. That was in a very short period of time. You brought out very well on the constitution, objectives, and the extent of challenges for the RDA and its current status, and the emphasis that you laid on that, for the ongoing PPPs and privatization to succeed, you would need to have one such body as soon as possible. Thank you very much. We'll have questions at the end of it. Now it's my privilege to invite our guest from the Florence School of Regulation, Professor Juan Montero. Pardon me if I am not able to pronounce, if I did pronounce your name correctly. A PhD, a doctorate in law from European University Institute, currently Professor of Administrative Law and Economic Regulation in the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia, UNED in Madrid, working with Florence School of Regulation, Transport Department since 2016, and as a part-time professor since February 2018. He's Associate Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Competition and Regulation in Network Industries. He's a member of the board of 360 Revista de Alta Velocidad and other journals. His research interests range from regulation of network industries, both traditional like railways, telecommunications, and posts, and new network industries like digital platform. That's interesting. And the interaction between them, particularly in transportation. He advises carriers and government agencies. Thank you very much, Professor Yuan, to be with us, and the stage is yours now.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you. Thank you for the opportunity to share some experiences we had with the liberalization of railways in Europe. If we can move to the next slide. I will try to be very brief, so we are on time. So next slide. In Europe, next slide, please. We have in Europe a very dense network. Probably you can see in the map, the densest network in the world. We have a very successful high-speed services in many countries, France, Italy, Spain, and very popular rail commuting services. But still, we have issues. We have issues because at the end of the day, we have 27 railway systems, and we are trying to integrate them in order to have one European single European railway area. So next slide, please. At the moment, just so you have the picture, we have in each member state, each country has a natural monopoly for the exploitation of the infrastructure. So we just have one infrastructure manager per country, and that's a monopoly. Then we have separated the traditional operators, the incumbents. So on the one hand, there is the infrastructure management, and even if it's in the same company, they have to create independent branches, separated ones for the exploitation of services. That's in this way we avoid conflicts of interest. In some countries, they have been fully separated, and they are different institutions, different entities providing the infrastructure management and the transport services. Then we have national regulators, which pretty much are focused on the regulation of access by railway undertakings to the infrastructure, to the railway infrastructure. And then on top of it, we have European legislation, which is common to all the member states. Next slide. I'm going to be very focused on the impact of the liberalization policies in, I would distinguish 3 spheres, so freight, long distance passenger service, and public service operations. So I will start with freight. This market was liberalized already in 2007, so it's been quite a long time already of liberalization. The process, we could say, has been quite successful in terms of that newcomers have reached a quite high market share of 39%. So that would mean that incumbents would have a 60% market share of all incumbents, each of them in their member states. So this is the average. So we could say that in terms of introduction of competition, one could say that it has been quite successful. But this liberalization has not delivered in which was expected to be the main outcome of liberalization, which was making the industry more competitive and to recover some market share from road. And that has not happened. I mean, modal share is still very low, 17%. It's half of what you have in India, I've heard, which is around 30%. And this modal share has pretty much stagnated over the last years. It has not grown, it's stable. In this sense, it is perceived that liberalization of freight services is not delivering, and something more has to be made. What is the issue? The issue is that in Europe, I mean, you know, railways is particularly competitive in freight transportation over very long distances. Now, very long distances in Europe means cross-border services because countries tend to be very small. Now, the issue we have is that we still have 27 railway systems, and it's very painful and expensive, slow, not very reliable for a freight service to travel across borders, across national borders. So this is the big challenge for the European system, to make cross-border, really long-distance services more efficient. And there are different initiatives to make it effective. Liberalization is one of them, but we have experienced that liberalization is not enough. We have to go farther. So next slide, please. We move to passenger services. Now, passenger services were liberalized just 1 month ago, December 14th, 2020. That was the date of the full liberalization of the market in all the European Union. However, there are a number of countries that already liberalized some years ago. So this is the experience that I'm going to share with you. First of all, we have the United Kingdom. They established this model of franchises already in the 90s, so time ago. They decided to create competition for the market through the tendering of franchises, around 20 of them, to cover all the services, all the passenger services in the country. It means that there is no, let's say, very little marginal competition in the market. So you don't have 2 different companies providing a service over the same route, but they just compete in the tendering process to get the license. This is a process that has to deliver an impressive increase in ridership, but still COVID and other circumstances have recommended to review this model. And right now it's under review. We don't know what the new policies will be. In Italy, we have 2 competitors very successful in high-speed services. In the Czech Republic, we have 3 competitors competing in long-distance services. We have competition also in other countries like Austria and Sweden. Next slide, please. So what was the result of this competition in the different countries? First of all, competition has been very limited in scope, in the sense that newcomers have focused only on the main corridors in each country. In some countries, they only provide 1 service between usually the 2 largest cities in the country. In some larger countries like Italy, services have gone farther than that, but still the scope, the geographic scope, the routes where you can find competition are very limited. Also, competition is very limited in terms of the number of new players. In all the countries, you only have 1 newcomer competing with the incumbent, so 2 operators. The only exception is the Czech Republic, where you have 3 competing operators. But in terms of prices and frequencies, the impact has been quite successful. Prices have gone down in all these countries quite significantly, in some cases up to 50%, so prices can have gone to half. That's quite impressive. And frequencies have increased very significantly, up to Again, not in all the experiences, but you can see that prices go down, frequencies go up. Another element is that financially, for railway undertakings, both incumbent and newcomers, these price reductions and increasing prices in frequency, has put them in financial difficulties. So this is one of the issues, and sometimes some financial intervention from the state in terms of support for companies or reduction in track access charges has been necessary. So next slide, we move to public service operations. 60% of EU rail passenger kilometers are under public service obligations. It means that they are funded by public authorities. This is very significant, of course, for commuting services, regional services, and even for some long-distance services. In these services, competition in the market is not expected, but there is this expectation to introduce competition in the form of tenders for the assignment of the contracts. We already have 41% of the services under competitive tendering, and there's been a cost reduction of around, say, 30% when these services are put for tender. Now, these tenders will be compulsory all around the European Union starting 2023. The next big country where they will experience with these tenders will be France, starting probably even this year. So these are the three elements. With this, I close the presentation of what has been the experience in Europe with the liberalization of freight, long-distance passenger services, and public service obligations. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yuan. Brought out so very well. Despite privatization traditions, there's not enough competition. There's something remarkable to note. 27 infrastructure managers, one network, the problems of coordination and future potential. Fantastic. So that was really a very wide canvas of issues from Europe and India, both commanding one of the the largest networks, railway networks of the world. I see that the audience has responded very warm-heartedly, and there are a lot of questions, and so let's see how many questions we can take up. So our time is the scheduled time is over, but we'll take just 15 more minutes to put a limit to ourselves, because we have to close it at some point of time. So I'll go with the first question being asked by an audience, name not identified. Experts say that coming year will be crucial for aviation industry. There may be a V-shaped recovery after COVID-19. Would that not be a big threat competition to railways, in particular the passenger segment? Let's start with a European view on this.
Well, this is a very hot issue in Europe at the moment. We could say that railways is proving more resilient than aviation through the COVID crisis. But it would be a little bit paradoxical. Aviation is getting a lot of public funding supporting the industry for COVID. This is not always the case of railways, so there is an asymmetry. So railways is proving more resilient, but it's not being rewarded with this public fund. And on the contrary, the industry that is not so resilient, it's getting more public funding and creating an asymmetry. Overall, there is a policy objective to kind of take profit of the crisis to get some modal shift and move some air passengers to railways, particularly short. The idea is to feed the big airports, not through short-haul flights, but through high-speed trains. And that has been the condition that has been introduced in some countries, like in France, for the public support for the aviation companies. So these are the two, I would say, the two elements. But the question is very good. We will see over the next months, once the crisis is over, really if this has changed the balance between aviation and railways.
All right, thank you, Professor. Professor Matthias, in India, we see the cross-subsidization of the passenger service operations through the goods train operations. Is it same? Jinal has a question. Both globally, as well as in India, which one is more profitable? Obviously, in India, goods trains are more profitable. What's your view on this, Professor Matthias?
Maybe I can step in because I think Matthias is not present anymore.
Okay, all right. Okay, please.
I think this is a key question. And Matthias was talking about this divergence in railway systems. I think this is key. It depends on the country. There are countries where freight is preponderant, it's the most important service. And in those countries, usually there might be some cross-subsidization. And that's the case of probably of India, it's the case of Russia, Ukraine. But then you have countries like in Western Europe, where it's the contrary. I mean, passenger is far more profitable than freight. And then you see the divergence. There are railway systems that are just preponderant freight. There are others that are preponderant passenger. And this tends to move to the extremes. So once a country goes for passengers, freight goes down. Once a country goes for freight, passengers go down. And it's very difficult to keep a balance. Maybe in India, you have a better balance that we have in the US or in Europe. Thank you.
All right, Professor Raghuram, there's a very favorite question of the audience. I've almost heard it numerous times. Do you see a really good future for bullet trains in India?
Yeah, my view is I think so. There's always been a debate. Shouldn't the money be used? What is the opportunity cost of the money going in? So first of all, given the cost of the project, 100,000 crores or whatever, only 20% of the money is Indian. Japan is giving us a very, very soft loan, which is available only for this project. So 20,000 crores leverages an additional 80,000. I think the positive spin-offs in terms of technology, in terms of precision components, high quality cement or whatever, which will percolate into other domains, is something that we should value. It would probably some kind of a game-changing connectivity between the Mumbai area, Ahmedabad area, and some of the intermediate points. Maybe it's just worth seeing, what impact it will have. And my sense for a country of India's size, given the high urbanization corridors, where big urban agglomerations are there, personally, I think that's a good way to go. And I think from a climate impact point of view, to the extent we are comparing it with air, it is much better off than air. Yeah.
So in line with this, just mentioned about climate change, and there's a question from Siddharth who's asking, I would love to have two references from you as well as from Sanjeev. By following what parameters, what actions do you think Indian Railways should take to become a net zero carbon emission entity by 2030, which is a very ambitious goal of Railway Ministry?
Sanjeev, yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I feel that currently it is estimated that Indian Railways are moving less than 30% of the freight traffic within the country. So if we are talking of, zero carbon, net zero carbon emission, that kind of target, then we need to raise this percentage share to minimum 50%, if not more, because that itself is a Herculean task. So until and unless we raise the share of freight traffic moving by rail, there doesn't seem to be any hope, in having that in meeting that kind of target as far as carbon emissions are concerned. That is my view, but Professor Raghuram, I'm sure, has done some research, maybe he can enlighten us better.
No, I would only look at the question in two ways. One is in the overall transport sector, how do you reduce the carbon emission? Obviously, the choice is very clear. We need far greater rail share.
Yes.
Now, and take traffic away from road. But of course, obviously the market is preferring road for some very good reasons. The door-to-door movement or flexibility they have, the shorter, smaller parcel sizes they can carry. So, unless railways are able to empathize from those needs of the end customer and provide their services, and not necessarily pure rail services, railways either in collaboration or by extending their own ambit. So, ultimately you have to look at what the customer wants. So that's of course the larger question. But given what railways themselves are, can they reduce their carbon impact? Of course. So I think electrification is a, is 100% electrification is a good move in that direction. I think using railway stations and for solar where solar panels can come on rooftop, there's a tremendous sort of scope. Then the railway land adjacent to railway tracks. In fact, there is an interesting thought going on that if you want to increase the speeds beyond 160 kilometers on the existing railway tracks for semi-high speed movement, then you need fencings, because given that in India you do have cattle and people crossing tracks at will, you will need a fencing. And there is this idea that can we put solar panels on the side of the rail embankment that will also double up as a fencing. So I think I'm just Indian Railways as an organization can definitely focus more on renewable energy sources, bring in more electrification, though it is viewed as more expensive. The diesel, those who love diesel in Indian Railways, diesel locomotives, I know there's a lot of thing about the economics, but I think from a long-term sense, electrification obviously allows you to source energy from different electricity generating mechanisms. And I think that is a plus point. Of course, now whether rolling stock can also have a rooftop solar, and I think there are experiments going on. I think railways, given the land that they own, and there is a fair bit they can do to just on their own, forgetting the market share aspect, which of course is a very important aspect.
True that. Professor Rachna, we have almost like as a team, we have converged on the need for setting up of this Railway Development Authority. What's the problem? What's your opinion on why it is going slow, or what is holding up? Your view on this, and then we'll have Mr. Sanjeev's view on this.
Yeah, this Railway Development Authority, was proposed in 2017. So it's still been a very long time. Why this has not been established. I think Mr. Garg would be the right person to answer this. So what is being held? I mean, why? What is the reason why this has been held up? So because he knows railways, even as a someone who has been in railways for a long time and now as the MD of PRCL, so he would be the right person.
So may I add a bit on this?
Please. Yes, sir.
So to me, it's not surprising. See, simple organizational dynamics will tell you the way railways are entrenched into variety of things they are doing. I mean, I'm not sure a regulator can easily also see, if you see what all they will not do. Some of those domains have, as Sanjeev Garg brought out, they already have statutory bodies. So now you're going to get one body which will just take a narrow slice of issues. So actually it has to be viewed comprehensively. And so you'll have to go back and change some other acts and all that. So it's a complex process. unless there is a strong will to do it. Now, the other way it may happen, if the private passenger train, I mean, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we will actually have some bidders. And if there are brave enough bidders who actually start operating trains, and then it comes out and, it is not, it will be very obvious to see that there are going to be conflicts. And then you're going to either go to court or, you're going to have all kinds of ways of complexities of resolving it. Maybe then the will come, a stronger will come. So I don't know, something like that has to happen. Otherwise, in fact, at one time I heard that somebody wanted to put in a clause that all members of this body will only be ex-railway officers. Which is another, I mean, that's like starting on the back foot. You actually want people who understand the concepts to come in and, challenge the way we are doing things. But, so, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Last two questions. We need to wind up now. To Professor Yuan, we see that the institutional frameworks have a very important role to play. Europe has this typical, quasi-federal kind of a European Union. So what areas are actually regulated by European Union and what are left to member countries in railways operations?
Well, the most relevant legislation is enacted at the European level. So we have, all the regulation, for instance, on public service obligations, that's European and that's directly enforceable. All the liberalization legislation, vertical separation, access, track access regulation, prices, etc., that's ruled by a European directive for the whole union, which then is implemented by national legislation. So basically, the legislation is European and enforcement is national, and the regulatory authorities are national. So we have 27 regulators, but they are basically applying European law. That's the scheme we have.
All right. Thank you. The last question for the day, and that's in line with liberalization and privatization. The assertion is that confidence of private sector is low given the past experiences. Many players who were expected to bid for passenger train services have not come forward. There are few who are bidding for all, but few who are not even come forward, not even bid for one. What can be done to gain their confidence? And I would expect some quick replies from all the Indian experts, and then some view from Professor Yuan as well. Starting with Rachna.
Yeah, the first and the foremost, as we have seen also in the case of the earlier initiative of container train operations. So the presence of an independent regulator is very, very essential. So from that experience, it has also been learned that many operators, those who have taken the licenses, either they have have not stepped up their operations to the extent it was expected. So their confidence has gone down from that experience, and that can be seen right now in the private train operations, passenger train operations as well, that some of the bidders, some of the companies that were expected to bid for this have not come forward. So
can we do something to shore up their confidence?
So regulation is something that is required to.
All right, I take it from regulation. Mr. Sanjeev.
Yeah. Well, the very fact that some established names who were expected to come and bid have not come forward itself is an indication regarding the lack of the confidence among the biggers that, once they have invested so much of money, they would be able to get justice regarding issues which will come up. So the very fact that they feel that justice will not be there and therefore their money can get sunk, literally get sunk. So they are not confident in taking, this step. And I can tell you that since currently I am as a, heading an organization where I am also facing such issues, and I am having to now, sit on the other side and face my ex-colleagues. So I am finding it difficult to get decisions in a what I would call an impartial manner. So there is an issue there. And in fact, most of my time goes in trying to tackle these issues and meeting officers right from Railway Board to Western Railway down below, and somehow, get these issues settled. So some of the issues, you'll be surprised, have been dragging for last 5-6 years. And we are not getting, either we are not getting a decision, or the decision which you get is absolutely unfair. So there is a very serious problem as far as regulation is.
So the feeling of fairness and justice is extremely important. Professor Raghuram? Professor Raghuram, what can we do to improve the confidence level of private operators? What can railways do?
No, I think one is, of course, we have talked about the structural solution of having a regulator, but that is currently not to be, at least in the current time frame. I think they can ease up a few things, but you see, some of them are already in the bid. So I don't know. I think we'll have to just wait until end of March and see what is the outcome. And then I think the railways have to take lessons away from it. I mean, for example, we began earlier by saying passenger trains is a cross subsidy. Indian Railways themselves are very happy to say that passenger trains in India are cross subsidized from the surpluses they make in freight. And so freight is overcharged and passengers. But when it came to the passenger train operations bid, they have not permitted that the revenue share bid can be a negative bid, meaning that a private party may want some money. So Indian Railways not only wants to track haulage charges, on top of it, they want a revenue share whose has to be on the positive side. Now, there is a lesson right in aviation. In aviation, we have the Udan scheme in India, where the Udan players are allowed to bid for a negative share, meaning where they want a subsidy to operate the flights to airports that may not be commercially viable or on routes that are not. So I'm saying there's enough around us, but I guess somewhere there is some internal thinking, possibly saying, no, we must make it a discipline. And the minute you allow negative, then everybody may go negative bidding. They may not apply, they put their best foot forward in thinking through. I don't know. Maybe these are the thoughts. So let's see. This is the first round. And as usual, in a country like India, we need multiple rounds to get things right. And we bumble our way. But, I think, I'm happy in the way things have moved overall in road, overall in telecom, in ports. I think it will happen in railways too. But, one would wish it could have happened faster, because conceptually there is academic clarity. But, but I think we have to make the same mistakes and then come out of it. Yeah.
Some closing comments on this issue, Professor Yuan?
I think 3 very basic comments. 1, liberalizing railways is more difficult than liberalizing telecoms, electricity, or aviation. That's something we learned in Europe. I mean, we liberalized telecoms in 10 years and it worked right. It took us more than 30 years to liberalize railways. It only happened 1 month ago, and we don't know if it will work. So it is more difficult. Second, you need legal certainty around access to tracks. So it means a good capacity allocation process, a good traffic management process, legal certainty, of course, on track access charges, and also very important, access to some ancillary services, to some service facilities like maintenance facilities, etc. So it's not only the tracks. And finally, all these cross subsidies between different services, that's good for a monopoly. But if you liberalize, you have to introduce transparency, and you have to substitute that cross subsidy, which is internal to the monopoly, with some kind of transparency and public intervention in order to organize those financial flows. That's the European. We have a lot of experience in Europe because in Europe we spend a lot on public services, and we have a European model of how to introduce public subsidies without distorting competition. And this is the public service obligation legal regime. That something in that line has to be organized.
Thank you very much. Panel, thank you very much, Professor Matthias, Professor Raghuram, Mr. Sanjeev, Professor Rachna, Professor Yuan, and the entire team at the back end, which is enabling all this. There has been an enthusiastic response from the participants. The questions asked, maybe not even 25% of all the questions that have been posed. And that's a mark of a very good discussion which we have had today. Thank you very much, Rachna, and all the gentlemen here. Thank you very much.